Hi there, beloved. It's such a pleasure to come to you once again with this Learning to Lead podcast. And I'm excited today to welcome my guest today, Dr. Corné Bekker, who is the Dean of the School of Divinity at Regent University. I've been privileged to know him and to be a colleague, work closely with him at the university and in other assignments and other places and lanes. And I'm excited today to talk about the subject of leadership, and we'll just see where this can take us because we could do this for hours today. So to put it into this podcast format will be challenging, but we'll do it. We'll do it. So thank you for joining us today, and make sure that you press like and subscribe and tell your friends about Learning to Lead. Dr. Bekker, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Great joy, Bobby. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So let's start with some basics so people get to know you a little bit better.
Right.
Where in the world where did the whole love and passion for leadership, the subject of leadership, and particularly Christian leadership, where did that arise from?
So I grew up in somewhat of a dysfunctional situation and had a radical conversion experience at a young teenage time period, and very quickly got roped into the church and very quickly into ministry. And it took me no time at all to discover that what I saw in the Gospels about the leadership of Jesus was not present in the church. And of course, as you grow on and as you develop, you also discover that maybe you have some own flaws. And it was that dysfunctional leadership that I saw not only in the church, but within me that started to kind of birth this question within me. What is leadership? And not only what is leadership, but can good leadership be trained? That's the real question.
Can it be developed?
Right.
Or is it a gift only?
Absolutely. And here's the more difficult thing, right? It's more easy or easier to speak about dysfunctional leadership than good leadership, right? Anybody that I've ever met can tell you a horror story of a terrible experience they've had with a leader. I didn't really want to study dysfunctional leadership. I wanted to ask a deeply personal question. Could I lead in moral and ethical ways? Could I be developed as a leader? And more importantly, could I lead like Christ? That was the primary question that led me to leadership.
Well, that ought to be a question every one of us ask every day.
Absolutely.
I'm fascinated, and I'm an admitted lover of the topic and became passionate myself a number of years ago about the study of leadership and really learning all that I can and then helping others in that regard. But I've always been fascinated by the surge of interest in the leadership topic. Well, maybe for 3 decades, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit longer, but noticeably to anyone, for 2 to 3 decades, it's like off the charts. I mean, whether it used to be Barnes & Noble, walk through Barnes & Noble, or now it's go on to Amazon.com and just try to look up leadership and look at the number of books and things that are available. Why is that? And was there something from a societal standpoint that triggered that level of interest, do you think? Do you have ideas or theories?
I think there are a number of things that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with the rise of motivational theory, kind of with the entrance of pop psychology and positive psychology into the world. People started to, I think a little bit more deep about motivation and about influence. In my mind, 2 very different things happened at the turn of the last century. And this is, I think, another reason why leadership becomes really interesting and important for us to study. I think, firstly, there's a lot of role confusion when it comes to what leadership is. There's this very, very famous writer and author who will go unnamed, who speaks about leadership in very beautiful ways, but he tends to distill leadership in just one word, and that he said, leadership is simply influence, nothing more, nothing less.
Right.
I would say yes, leadership includes influence, but I think one of the things that happened is that people started to become deeply interested in the pursuit of fame, fortune, prestige, notoriety, and influence. And so a lot of the texts that we see on leadership are often what I would call dysfunctional texts with dysfunctional worldviews. And what it tends to do is that it draws the kind of people looking for their own identity. But at the same time, at the turn of the century, I think folks started to realize, and we maybe can push it a little bit further back, with the extraordinary 2 world wars that we had, people started to recognize that leadership, number one, matters. And secondly, that dysfunctional, toxic, destructive leadership can make a huge impact upon our world.
Which they had some very visible examples of that.
Absolutely. And so I think from the 50s, 60s, 70s, we have these 2 streams of interest in leadership studies. Some of it very shallow, some of it very much connected with motivational theory. And then I would say amongst Christians, theorists, and non-Christians, there have been people that have said, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be.
That's interesting. Well, I've heard you talk many times about leadership, and you make a very clear distinction between paradigms of leadership. And much of your study and speaking and teaching on leadership has focused on your personal paradigm of leadership that is biblical, that is rooted in Scripture.
Right.
And that's really, really important to you and to me, and should be to others. So let's talk a little bit about we talked about maybe the shallow definition of leadership. Let's go a little bit deeper. So now, given your years of reflection and observing popular leadership, reading material, and your own study of the Bible, where are you at now on how leadership is one of the most difficult things to define because it's
slippery, right?
It really is slippery. So do your best. Give us your best shot here.
Right. So the question of how to identify leadership, and let me take a really broad view here. The first document that we actually find that describes leadership outside of the Hebrew Scriptures is found in Plato's Republic, where he is thinking very carefully about what does it mean to lead a nation in the context of seeing some very dysfunctional leadership models within the Greco-Roman world as well. Since Plato, this quest to define leadership has really continued on. And most people, when they think of leadership, would define it in the following way. They would say, leaders are brokers of power. That's ultimately, when you look at absolutely every single definition that we find within secular literature, it really breaks down to this idea that leaders broker power. I think there should be a radically different way to think of leadership. And strangely enough, the best definition that I found in secular literature comes from a chap called Joseph Jaworski. He's a theorist, and Jaworski writes in a book, Synchronicity, and he gives this definition of leadership. He said, ultimately, what leaders do, they broker reality. What leaders ultimately do is that they have the ability to see reality, to describe reality to their followers, and to bring their followers into ultimate reality. Now, for us as Christians or people of faith, when we look at Scripture, this is what we ultimately see. The oldest description that we find in the New Testament of leadership comes from a hymn.
Yes.
The famous Christological hymn in Paul's letter to the church in Rome and Philippi, where Paul quotes a hymn that we think predates him perhaps by 2 decades. This might be the earliest confession of faith. But what's even more interesting, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the first time we find the word lead, or the construct of leadership, is also in a hymn. And it's the very famous Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, where Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt and through this miraculous parting of the sea, sings a song about God. And right smack in the middle of that song, in a rhetorical sense, in a structural sense, but also in a thematic sense, we find the singular description of God that describes him as a leader. And it gives them the attributes of his leadership. When I think of leadership as an ultimate brokering of reality, Moses steps in here and helps his followers understand what just happened, and then more importantly, broker that reality to them and give them the purpose necessary to take that next step into the promised land.
So you see Moses' song there as really focusing on God as a leader.
Not only as God as a leader, which is the ultimate reality, but secondly, gives a paradigm. So many scholars have looked at that hymn as well as they've done and looked at the Christological hymn in Paul's letter to the Philippians. And both hymns have a mimetic attribute to them. In essence, both hymns invites us to imitate God. And so many scholars have said as Moses sings the song, he's not only thinking about God as leader, but how does he lead the people of God? And this is the first extraordinary test for Moses as he walks through this very difficult situation of the confrontation with the Egyptians and see God act. And so in both hymns, there's this mimetic aspect saying leadership is about a higher example. And you ask the question, what has driven this desire for leadership studies? Again, two very interesting things. I think there's a greatly dysfunctional kind of element to it where people are asking the question, how can I be more influential? How can I have more influence? How can I have more power? But then there's another side. And this is where I think people of faith and people of no faith have looked at this world and said, there's got to be a better way. There's an authentic search for a higher model. And what we find in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures are these extraordinary examples of something higher, something greater than us, something that we can imitate. And so to complete my thought on this, when Jaworski say that leaders are brokers of knowledge, leaders are people that have seen a better way, a higher way, and lead people into that better, higher, ethical way.
I'm going to ask you to dig just a little deeper in the Philippians, just so everyone who's watching this knows what we're talking about. Philippians chapter 2 is that wonderful hymn that focuses on Christ. Dig a little bit more deeper into the example of Christ as our supreme, ultimate model and example of leadership.
So a little bit more context about this hymn. So we discover this hymn in a letter that Paul writes to the church in Roman Philippi. And we know it's a hymn because of the rhetorical structure. So it looks like a hymn, it sounds like a hymn.
Yes.
It is structured like a poem. What is also interesting is that the Greek there is a little bit older than the Greek that we find in the rest of the letter. So we know it's maybe 2 decades old. And what is surprising is what we know of Roman Philippi. We know more about Roman Philippi in the first century than any other city except Rome of the first century. And what do we know about this? Roman Philippians were obsessed with honor, obsessed with public honor. In actual fact, using Plato's description, their desire for leadership was marked by a timocratic ideal. So Plato refers to this as timocratic leadership, from timao, honor. This is people that's obsessed with power, prestige, and privilege. And what's interesting is that we have inscriptions in Roman Philippi that kind of marks out how do you become a top leader. Theorists refer to this as a cursus honorum, a course of honor. And if you think about today, we have such things. How do you become a great leader?
Yes.
And it's often connected of how we look, how we dress, how we speak, what do we say, be strong, that kind of ideal, this kind of ideal of perfection. What is surprising is that this hymn originates in that context. And this hymn says, no, there's a different example. And the hymn starts off with this desire to imitate. So the hymn starts off by saying, let this attitude, let this example, let this mind, it's a difficult thing to translate into English, be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. And then the hymn says, even though he was God, it was no stretch for him to think that he was God because he was God.
Right.
The hymn then describes 5 what I would call leadership stances, attitudes that Christ embodies. And the hymn then maps it out beautifully. It said, number 1, he made himself of no reputation. We get the theological term kenosis from that. And what is kenosis? What is that self-emptying? There's a marvelous guy by the name of Corne, a theologian who defines this. And he says, kenosis is the resolute divesting of every claim of self-interest, so as to be ready to live the gospel free from what you want or what you desire. And that first attribute is the willingness to let go of power, prestige, privilege in order to lead.
It's a prerequisite.
It's not only a prerequisite, it is the most provocative idea in leadership.
Yes.
That you could lead by giving up stuff. Yeah. When you think leadership is all about making reputation today.
Yeah, that's the paradox.
And here's completely the opposite. Secondly, the hymn says that Jesus made himself a servant. He took on the form of a servant. In the Greek, it's a little bit stronger. Culturally, it's very difficult to say this word. In the Greek, it's really, he took on the form of a slave. And every time I think about how provocative this idea is, it's not only that he became a servant, he looked like a servant. And this is the part that we don't like. People don't mind serving, but they don't want to look like a waiter or like a servant, right?
That's right.
Then thirdly, it said, he came in the likeness of man. He embraced his humanity and the humanity of others, which I think is an extraordinary paradigm when you think of leadership. What makes for greatly dysfunctional leadership in others, and certainly I've experienced in my own life, is when there's not authenticity, when there's a mask that is being worn, this idea, an ideal that you hold up to. And then the last 2 attributes of the hymn, it says that he actively humbled himself. Humility, which I will tell you is a very difficult thing to study and a very difficult thing to pursue.
Yes.
And then lastly, radical obedience, which the hymn says obedience unto death. So when you think of those 5 attributes of the leadership of Jesus, it's not difficult to immediately see that this hymn is in stark contrast to Caesar and to the timocratic ideals of leadership that we find in the first century. It stands in stark contrast to everything we see in Plato's description of what a good leader is in any examples that we have. And the hymn says, you have to imitate Christ. And when you do that as a leader, these are the 5 attributes: self-emptying, the willingness to take on the form of a servant, the willingness to be authentic and to embrace the authenticity of others, radical humility, and obedience to a mission.
It should make all of us want to reopen Philippians chapter 2 and just do some serious meditation there. Because I think frequently, even theologians will focus on the humanity, deity parts of that scripture, but there's so much more there. And
Absolutely.
it's encouraging for us as Christian leaders to look at that as a model for following Christ's example in leadership even. Let's talk a little bit about practical realities of people who are developing an interest in becoming a leader or a sense of calling. Maybe they're in the early stages of coming to grips with what God is speaking to them about their future and their calling and their purpose. And they're toying with the idea of maybe God's really called me to lead. I recall when I had those moments and those experiences. They're so important. They're formative. So what kind of advice would you give someone who is from let's limit it obviously to a Christian context. So a believer who's saying, I really think maybe God's called me to some kind of leadership. As they're thinking about this, praying about it, how can we advise them in some wonderful lessons of experience that we've had?
I think the first thing to recognize is how precious a call is.
Yes.
There's really nothing more precious than to be called by God. The second thing that happens is that often in our pursuit of leadership, we fall into the trap of not imitating Christ, but imitating people. I've been reading through the Gospel of John, particularly looking at leadership. And it's the church father John Chrysostom in his commentary on John that really got me into the study. And he says, John's gospel is framed by two leaders. The gospel starts with the story of John the Baptist, tremendously important. And then right at the end, of course, with the restoration of Peter. And you see both these leaders deeply struggling with the idea of who am I? Now, the truth of the matter is that you are not born as a leader. Leaders are ultimately formed. There's this long conversation where the leadership traits are inherent or whether they can be cultivated. I think it's somewhere in the middle.
Yes, of course.
I think leadership is evoked by God. And the most tremendous and for me the most important thing in our pursuit of a call and in our pursuit of leadership is to focus on what is necessary and what is the kind of formation that needs to take place and to be open to that journey. Along the path of leadership development, there are great dangers and lots of possibilities to lose the way.
And a lot of people advocating one or the other.
Absolutely. And you see leaders lose the way.
Yes.
And even every extraordinary leader that I know of at one time or another lost the way or missed the mark. And it's not that those things disqualify them for leadership, but it might just be that corrective. So what is the corrective? What is the way? There are these two extraordinary poles in leadership development that I'm starting to understand. Firstly, when we are called to leadership, we are called to something higher.
Yes.
Which means we need to have our eyes opened to that better way, that greater ideal. I come originally from South Africa, and I had the opportunity to meet with Nelson Mandela, our first democratic president. And in a private meeting, I asked him this question. I said, this was after he was president. So he was already retired after the first 4 years, which, by the way, in African leadership is the most unusual thing. Historically, in African leadership, when leaders finally got the time to
you do everything to hold on to it.
And he didn't.
Right.
After 4 years, he said, it's not good for me to stay.
Yeah.
I need to go. And so I was deeply interested in how did he understand that. And so I had a 10-minute opportunity. And so I said to him, "Sir, how did you learn how to lead?" It's the only one question that I had an opportunity to ask him. And this is what he said. He said, "In the mission school that I was brought up, I read the Sermon on the Mount. And there he had a better ideal. He saw a better way, a different way, a provocatively different way." So on the one pole, on the way extreme of leadership development, your eyes have to be opened to what Jaworski refers to as ultimate reality. Something greater, something beyond the struggles of our world. On the other side, you have to be real about who you are and allow yourself to be transformed not only by the call, but by the people and by the context in which God has placed you. That kind of transformation stands at the heart of the Christian faith. I would also maintain that it stands at the heart of any kind of leadership development. And what's amazing is when you look at Christians' understanding of transformation, it always deals with three acceptances of greater reality. Paul describes this quest of transformation, and he says that's the reason why we exist.
Yeah.
He says, before we were created, God knew about us. He says this in his letter to the Romans. And he said not only did God know about us, but he provided us with a predestiny to be conformed to a better image, that image of Christ. And that process of transformation is to have that ideal. Why am I here? For some of us, of course, the question is not, why am I here? Why am I still here? Why am I still alive? Why does God still allow me to lead? Why, has he not removed me? These are really good questions. Because there's an ideal at the end. There's a plan. And that plan is to be transformed into this ideal image. The question, of course, is how. And this is really central to my own quest, which is deeply personal. How am I transformed? And how can leaders be transformed? Quick anecdotal story. When I started to teach in a leadership school and then later in a seminary, I discovered that most people that come to either a leadership school or seminary come for the wrong reasons. I'm thoroughly convinced that I came to leadership for all the wrong reasons.
Right, you can relate.
But the question is, can we stay for the right reason? Can we be transformed? And Paul later on describes how that transformation takes place. In a second letter, depending on how you count, this might be the fourth letter, that Paul writes to the church in Corinth. He revisits this idea. And this is what he says. He says, when we come together, I'm going to use my translation here of the text. He says, when we come together and you take off the mask and you gaze at Christ, you are transformed. You can unpack those principles in leadership formation. Leadership starts by seeing a need. We have too many leaders who are obsessed with self-actualization and cannot see the need. And when I say leadership is evoked, think of somebody like Nelson Mandela, who saw the need for an ethical difference in South Africa, where apartheid, a crime against humanity, he saw that and he said, we can do better. There's a different way of leading. And so leadership should really always come within the context of need, when our eyes are open. I ask leaders this question: when you see yourself lead, do you see yourself on stage or do you see people transformed?
Yeah. It's important.
That's the key. When people think leadership is about building brand and taking glamour shots and getting your own logo and those kind of things, I'm not saying those things are not important, but they're not primary. But if you can see the people that you will serve, that's how that transformation starts. The second thing that happens, Paul says, you've got to take off the mask. You have to come with an unveiled face. True leaders are people that are deeply aware of what they are unable to do. They're also, true leaders are people that are deeply cognizant of their own failures. And when they can see that, there can be a transformation that happens. But if you only have those two things, if you only have the context of where the leadership needs to take place and the ability to really face yourself, there's no ethical ideal that can be developed. There's a third component. In a Christian sense, you've got to gaze at Christ. The medieval theologians refer to this as the beatific vision, that your eyes are open. The Reformers call it as coram Deo in Latin. If your eyes can open and you can see Christ. A good example of this you find in the final book in the New Testament, where John, who's a leader, is captured by the Romans and he's placed on this prison island, Patmos, which today is lovely and beautiful, but it was a quarry in the first century. And he prays for the church and he has this vision. And for me, here's the best description of what ethical leadership is about. He sees a vision of Christ, the ultimate leader. And he hears a voice that says, come up here and I will show you. And ultimately, leadership, true moral, ethical leadership, is a leadership that's focused on the need, a leadership that's focused on our own limitations and what we're able to bring to the table with a willingness to be transformed. But ultimately, this brokering of reality is about going deeper, going further, what is greater, what is a better way.
Studies have been done to demonstrate to us a reality that matches up with what many of us look around the world and look at society and read the headlines and know. Leaders without that sense of transformation, without being changed on the inside and becoming more like Christ, will fail. And we find a number of things that are written to show us the percentages of leaders, even in the Bible, not to mention historical leaders, who simply failed at the end and did not finish, in Paul's terms, did not finish well, did not finish their race well. So we ought to be humbled by the reality that Scripture is saying. If you take the whole of it and take all the leaders in the Bible, you go, wow, it's a small percentage really finish well. So what does that mean for us today? So as we're those who are interested in becoming the leader God wants them to be, or for those of us who are really interested in helping to develop leaders to finish well, how can we do that more effectively? And what are some practical suggestions that you might offer? And I say this to you, yes, I understand that you're responsible for a seminary, but the inner aspects also. Obviously, the mental acuity is important, but from a life transformation, how can we upgrade our leaders to have more leaders that are finishing well?
Once again, I think we need to have the long view here. And the question is not whether you as a leader will fail, because the answer is very simple. If you lead, you will fail.
Yes.
In one way or another.
Yeah.
That failure can be an extraordinary open door to transformation. The ultimate failure is when those smaller failures on the path are not embraced.
Yes.
And not seen as an open door for possible transformation. the question is, how do you end? You mentioned all these leaders, examples of leaders that we have in the Bible. What is amazing to me is that not a single one of them lived a life of no failure. People often ask me this as a biblical scholar, how do I know the Bible is true? It's a really good question, and I can go on for hours about how I know this. But one way that I know it, who would write books about themselves and write what these authors wrote? You look at a book like Jonah. There really is nothing positive about Jonah from the beginning to the end. He ends worse than what he's been. When you think of the fact that the Gospel of Mark, early church would tell us that this represents the preaching of Peter, Peter could have turned around and Mark say, listen, you write nothing of my failures. Yet throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, every author highlighted moments of monumental failure. But when I speak of that beatific vision, not only of Christ, not only of God, it gives us a vision of where we could be if we follow. And the path that is laid out before us includes these moments of monumental failure. But I think if we can embrace those failures and learn from that, we can be transformed. Now, that quest to end strong, how do you do this? It's interesting that Peter, who had a very public failing and a very public restoration, in his letters used that term. He used that term and he says, how do you finish strongly? How do you end? In both Peter's first and second letter, he gives 3 principles of how do you end them. And the first thing that he says, keep on loving. And I just want to stop here for a moment. It's a monumental thing to learn how to love. It's a monumental thing to learn how to love followers. It's a monumental thing to learn to love yourself, to extend that same grace that God has given to people, to yourself. And when I look at what Peter is saying, I think here's one of the greatest quests in how do we finish strong. So Peter first he says, keep on loving. The second thing that he says is keep on serving. And so often leaders fail because they get disconnected with the original purpose for which they were called. And you and I have seen it a million times, right? Where people get so excellent at what they do that they forgot the reason why they are doing it. It's the quintessential story of an artist that becomes so good at singing that forgets, who am I writing these songs for? Who am I singing? Because it's all focused on the individual.
Right.
But then thirdly, and this maybe is the most important thing, Peter consistently says, Peter, the same person that failed and ended well. How did he get there? He would say this, he says, keep that day in mind. It's a fascinating thing in both his letters. He says, keep that day. What day is he talking about? That final consummation. That image of a world restored. Mm-hmm. That image, that vision of a place where our world is fully restored, every wound healed, every tear wiped off our face. Dysfunctional leadership often happens when there's no ethical ideal there, no dream.
So you think Peter's reason for mentioning that is simply to keep us with perspective, so that today we lead, we walk with perspective of the end that day?
Absolutely. And if you think again of Peter, Peter failed in that he publicly denied Christ because of fear of what a young servant girl would say. But he ends being crucified upside down in the circus of Nero in front of the Roman emperor and tens of thousands of people in the most powerful city, in the most powerful place in the world. And you look at how Christ took his weakest moment and turned it into his greatest strength.
Yes.
Because he could keep that in mind. All of us, every leader, needs that vision of a world that could be, of a world that God has designed. And that hope in mind, that certain hope, helps us to let go of temporal connections or temporal things that we chase. And at that time, you stop chasing fame and money and power, and that you say, I want to participate in that world.
Yeah.
I want God to use me for that.
And usually those of us who don't finish well, it really does boil down to those temporal. It's some kind of a connection, addiction, whatever, to those temporal things, isn't it? I mean, that's what takes us out.
Immediate gratification.
Yeah. Yeah.
And understanding that my leadership is not for me. The best way, I had a spiritual director that at some point just looked me in the eye and said, get over yourself. This is not about you, right?
Yes.
And you see leaders not only hold on to power as they fail, but you've seen leaders step out and disqualify themselves also because of failure. And both aspects, you put yourself in the seat of God. And you're saying, I get to decide. But ultimately, somebody asked me this question yesterday, a student said to me, how do I know if I'm called? Such a good question. And this is what I said, whatever you cannot escape.
That's right.
The calling pursues you.
Yeah.
And once you focus on the fact that he has called you. Now, even for folks that are non-believers, they can sense there's something that I've been created for. Something that I'm supposed to pursue. And it's when that big ideal, that larger call is no longer gazed at or looked at, that we have these failures that continue. May I also say that the only failure that remains is the failure that you refuse to learn from. And that's how folks don't finish well.
Yeah. Powerful. Final point it will need to be. Let me use this as an opportunity to invite any of you to please join us. And Dr. Bekker is going to be one of our plenary speakers at the Leadership Summit. It's an annual event for Vanguard Ministries. I'm honored to be able to lead that organization. We have an upcoming gathering on May 6 and 7, 2025. It's going to be in the Virginia Beach area. And all you need to do to register is simply to go to vanguardconferences.com. So this is an unabashed promotion for that event, and we would love for you to join us, and Dr. Bekker and others who will be joining us will have a wonderful time of growing together, learning from one another, iron sharpening iron. It's a blessing today to have you with us. Dr. Bekker, thank you for joining us on Learning to Lead.
Thank you so much, Bobby.
Thanks for tuning in to Learning to Lead. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and follow Dr. Bobby Hill on social media for more inspiration, insights, and updates. For more information on his ministry roles and resources, visit drbobbyhill.com.